Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing headaches. Okay, so we are currently in the process of trying to understand tension-type headaches and the pathophysiology behind tension-type headaches. So, what I have told you so far is that we believe at present that the pain of a tension-type headache originates from the muscles of the head region. Now, of course, we know that tension-type headache pain is typically felt in the temporal regions of the head, and it can extend into the frontal regions and the occipital regions. Therefore, we need to look at muscles that are in those regions, and that's precisely what I've just been showing you. I have shown you the frontalis muscles that are in the frontal region, the temporalis muscles in the temporal regions, and the occipitalis muscles in the occipital regions. All of these 6 muscles will be innervated by primary nociceptive afferents. The nociceptors will be in the muscle tissue, and there will be multiple nociceptors in a single one of these muscles, and they will be connected to primary nociceptive afferents. And we believe that those nociceptors become activated and fire and cause the primary nociceptive afferents to fire action potentials, and that is what causes the pain of a tension-type headache. Now, of course, there is a gaping question that still remains to be answered here, which is how do the triggers of tension-type headaches, such as emotional stress, fasting, what was the other one I said, sleep deprivation and inflammation, how do those actually result in the activation of these nociceptors in these muscles, and therefore the generation of action potentials, which then gives us the conscious sensation of pain once the message has gone up to higher centres in the brain? And I'm going to leave you hanging with regards to the answer of that question. The answer is not particularly satisfying at present. We don't really know for most of those triggers. But for one of them, we do have a good idea, which is inflammation, and we can sort of begin to speculate that the others may be similar. But the answer to that will come much, much later. We will go back to that, I will answer that, but you're going to have to wait for a while. Instead, at present, what I want to do is go over a whole bunch of anatomy. I have told you that these primary nociceptive afferents that are innervating these muscles that I've drawn here, their central processes are going to go into something that I gave you the name of but haven't really explained properly, the Trigeminal-cervical complex, or TCC for short. This is the collection of second-order neurons that can take or relay the information from these primary afferents that are coming in. And indeed, all of the primary nociceptive afferents from the head and neck region of the body will send their central processes into this structure, the trigemino-cervical complex, and there they will synapse on a second-order neuron which will relay the information up to higher centres. I want to now go over a huge amount of anatomy. I want to talk about the nerves that are going to feed into this, and you can guess it's trigeminal nerves and cervical nerves. So we'll start by going over the trigeminal nerves. I also then want to go over the anatomy of this thing itself, and I want to look at the pathways by which information, the second-order neurons from this thing, the trigemino-cervical complex, can send their information up to the thalami and then up to the primary somatosensory cortexes. So I'm going to go over a lot of anatomy / neuroanatomy at this point. And you might think, well, is this really necessary? And the answer is probably no. However, this is going to be a massive video on headaches, and this structure, the trigemino-cervical complex, we are going to see it over and over again in the different types of headaches that we are going to study, and I really do think that understanding this, therefore, is important to have a full understanding of headaches. So we are going to revise a whole bunch of anatomy and neuroanatomy. And that revision of anatomy is going to begin by revising the structure of the trigeminal nerves. So we are going to see where the trigeminal nerves come out. We're going to have a look at the trigeminal ganglion. We're going to look at the 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve, and we're going to look at the major branches of those as well. And that's where we'll begin this background of anatomy. So, put to one side at the moment the questions that we had about tension type headaches. We're doing some background anatomy that will help us to understand this and will also be relevant when we're looking at all the other types of headaches as well. So I think we'll go up here to do it. So we are going to study the trigeminal nerves. So I'll just put a little title here, and I think I'll go for the thick pen because I quite like the thick pen, or the thicker pen. So we're going to study the trigeminal nerves. And of course, those of you who remember anatomy will know that the trigeminal nerves have another name. There are two of them, by the way, there's not just one. Everyone always refers to the trigeminal nerve, but it is the trigeminal nerves. There is a left trigeminal nerve and a right trigeminal nerve. Anyway, back to my original question. Those of you who remember anatomy will remember that there is another name for the trigeminal nerves. They are also called the fifth cranial nerve. So these are cranial nerve 5. So you have two cranial nerves 5. The left cranial nerve 5 and the right cranial nerve 5. And of course, CN5 I've written here. CN is short for cranial nerve, and because it's pretentious old anatomy, we love to do Roman numerals rather than normal numbers, so CN5 here. Right, so I want to go over the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve with you, and this will be nice because we will actually start to see where, for instance, if we had a nociceptor in a frontalis muscle, where the primary nociceptive afferent might actually go in order to get into the brain. So it will all actually help our understanding here. To show the trigeminal nerve then, what I'd like to do is firstly draw a picture of the cranial cavity viewed from the top. So what I'm going to imagine doing is I'm going to imagine cutting open the top of the skull here, taking off the top and looking down from above into the cranial cavity, and I want to see all of the different cranial fossae. I want to put on the brainstem there, and I want to show the trigeminal nerves coming out of the pons, because that's where they come out of. They come out of the front of the pons, which is the second part of the brainstem. And I think the best way to show this is to draw a picture, as I've just described, looking down from above into the cranial cavity. So this is going to represent our cranial cavity. It's a little bit more pointy than I'd ideally have it, but I think it'll do. So I want to split this now up into the three cranial fossae: the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. So here we go. So remember, the anterior cranial fossa is higher than the middle cranial fossa, and the middle cranial fossa is higher than the posterior cranial fossa, so their heights go down gradually. So here is the boundary of the anterior cranial fossa here, and of course we'll have the clinoid processes here. So there's one clinoid process, there's another clinoid process, which you see if you do indeed have a model skull and you can open up the top, you'll see those little pointy bits on either side of the, or demarcating the edges of the chiasmatic groove where the optic chiasm sits. Then behind this bit here, you will of course have the sella turcica, or the pituitary fossa, where the pituitary gland sits. So the pituitary gland is very small and sits right in the centre of this bit here. And then let's put on the petrous portions of the temporal bone, one there and one here, which demarcate the edge of the middle cranial fossa going into the posterior cranial fossa. And I think one final thing to put on here is probably foramen magnum there. Okay, so this is a very rough drawing of what you would see if you chopped off the top of the skull and looked down. This is the front, this is the back. This is the anterior cranial fossa, all of this. All of this is the middle cranial fossa. Remember, there is not two middle cranial fossae. This is something that used to confuse me. I used to think there were two middle cranial fossae, left one here and a right one here. There is not. We think of it all as one because, of course, the pituitary fossa here has no lateral boundaries, so it's more like a tube through here. So it is as though the two sides here are very nicely connected by the pituitary fossa here. So we think of this as all one middle cranial fossa. And then of course here we have the posterior cranial fossa with the foramen magnum there. Right, so what I now want to do is imagine that we're not going to put any of the other bits of the brain on, but we're just going to put the brainstem on. And indeed, we're just going to put the first two portions of the brainstem on. So remember, the brainstem consists of three parts, the medulla, the pons, and then the midbrain, and it is the continuation, effectively, of the spinal cord once you've gone through foramen magnum. So the medulla is at the bottom, then the pons is in the middle, and the midbrain is on the top. I'm just going to now put on the medulla and the pons. So after we've come through foramen magnum, we're then going to have the medulla, and it's going to be slouched up against that front wall of the posterior cranial fossa here. So there's bone here. It's this sort of region, not that sort of region, it's this sort of region here. And the medulla is just sort of slouched up against that. It's leaning on it, or supported by it. So here it is, in a badly chosen, very sort of faint colour that isn't showing up particularly well. So I'll colour it in, I think. Here we go. There, it shows it better. So that's representing the medulla, and of course the spinal cord would be below it, outside of the skull, through foramen magnum. So that's the first portion of the brainstem. I'll label it up here. It is the medulla. If you want to give it its full name, you can give it medulla oblongata. I've never heard anyone actually in normal conversation ever call it that. It's the medulla. But there's its full name. Let's now put on the pons, the bit that we're actually interested in, because this is where our beautiful trigeminal nerves come off. So let's now put the pons in here, in red. So this is the sort of position of the pons. It's again slouched up against that anterior wall or anterior floor of the posterior cranial fossa. So this is the pons here. Now, this is a very basic picture. You can gain that from the way I've drawn it. I'm just basically showing where these two portions of the brainstem actually are in the skull. This is not what it actually looks like. And it will be much more complicated because it has the cerebellar peduncles coming out the back, which connect it with the cerebellum that's sitting here. What I now want to show is where the trigeminal nerves come off the pons, and to do this properly I would like to now draw another picture of the medulla and the pons as though we're seeing them from the front. So let me just do this quickly here. So this will be a slightly better picture than that other one. So here is the medulla, like so, and then of course the spinal cord would be below it. Then we have the pons sitting on top, like this. Okay, so we're imagining we're now looking from the front, so what I now want to put on is the two trigeminal nerves, and they come off the front of the pons midway down, so in this position and this position, so let's just mark them on. So here is the right trigeminal nerve, because remember we're thinking we're looking from the front here, and here is the left trigeminal nerve. Let's now add them onto this other picture. So they move forward from the pons and they go over the petrous portion of the temporal bone. They go over this little fence here. So there's one. And here is another one also in green there. So those are the two cranial nerve 5s, the two trigeminal nerves, left and right. Okay, so continuing on with the anatomy, we've only shown a tiny little bit of these nerves so far. Next thing that happens is they go into the trigeminal ganglion. So pretty much as soon as the trigeminal nerve comes off the pons, it goes into the trigeminal ganglion. So let me show this in. We'll have a vivid colour of purple here. So this purple splodge in this position, and it is in the middle cranial fossa, just like so. This is the trigeminal ganglion. So let me put its name down here. So this is representing the trigeminal ganglion. Now, there is another name for the trigeminal ganglion which people do often use, which is to call it the semilunar ganglion. So I'll put that as another possible name. I'm not going to call it the semilunar ganglion. I will call it the trigeminal ganglion. I think that's somewhat more an obvious name for it. So, what happens in this ganglion? Well, remember what a ganglion is. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies that is outside of the central nervous system. Now you might say, hang on a moment, is this outside of the central nervous system? And my answer is yes. It's no longer considered part of the central nervous system. Remember the way that we distinguish between peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. In the central nervous system, the myelination of neurons' axons or neurons' processes is carried out by oligodendrocytes, whereas in the peripheral nervous system, the myelination of neurons, axons, is carried out by Schwann cells, and those types of cells are very, very different to histologists. So that's the major difference. So this trigeminal nerve is counted as peripheral nervous system, presumably because its axons are myelinated by Schwann cells. So this is a ganglion, a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system, whereas remember, a collection of cell bodies inside the central nervous system is called a nucleus. Right, so there's going to be lots of cell bodies here. What cell bodies are going to be here? Well, what does the trigeminal nerve carry? Well, of course, it carries nerve fibres. Most of the nerve fibres in the trigeminal nerve are sensory, not motor. It does carry some motor fibres. Mainly, the main ones are the motor fibres to the muscles of mastication. So, for instance, the motor fibres to the temporalis muscles. But the main fibres that it carries are sensory fibres. Not just pain fibres, also other forms of sensation. And remember the other forms of sensation. Let's list them off. Fine touch, crude touch, vibration sensation, proprioceptive sensation, temperature sensation, and then of course there is pain sensation as well. All those other types of sensation, they're all mediated or carried by pseudo-unipolar neurons as well as pain. All of the different types of primary sensory afferents have this same picture. All you'd have to do is change the actual structure on the end that senses whatever it's sensing, and which activates the thing to fire an action potential. Now, why did I get into this? Well, the trigeminal nerve is going to carry sensory fibres that innervate tissues mainly of the facial region of the head rather than the back of the head. Fibres innervating the back of the head and the neck with sensory information, they're going to go into the cervical spinal nerves rather than the trigeminal nerves, and we'll discuss that later on. And hopefully, again, you're sort of clicking together the little pieces. Trigeminal, cervical complex, it's all starting to fall together now. But why have I brought this up? Because this ganglion, this trigeminal ganglion, this is where the cell bodies of the pseudo-unipolar neurons are going to be placed. The trigeminal nerve is bringing in these sensory fibres. These peripheral processes, eventually they have to have their cell bodies. Where are their cell bodies going to be located? These ganglia are full of the cell bodies of primary sensory afferents, including the primary nociceptive afferents that are innervating tissues of the facial region. So, to absolutely spell this out, the cell body of pseudo-unipolar primary sensory afferents that come in the trigeminal nerve will be in the trigeminal ganglia. The central process will then go through the major trigeminal nerve route here in green, the full trigeminal nerve, into the pons, and then will come to this thing called the trigeminal cervical complex. They'll specifically go to the trigeminal nucleus component of the trigeminal cervical complex, but we'll come on to all of this juicy stuff later on. The peripheral process of the pseudo-unipolar neuron will then go outwards from the output from the trigeminal ganglion here, and the three outputs. Now, not all of the fibres of the trigeminal nerve are actually primary sensory afferents. There are some motor fibres in there. I said the muscles of mastication, the chewing muscles, such as temporalis, but there are others as well. They're innervated by motor fibres that run in the trigeminal nerve. Now, motor fibres, motor neurons, they have their cell body inside the central nervous system, so they will have their cell body inside the pons. We'll see where later on. And the axon, the major axon of those multipolar motor neurons, will come out in the trigeminal nerve and then will run through the trigeminal ganglion. And you might think, well, isn't this confusing? It's running through a sensory ganglion. It doesn't have to have its cell body there. It's quite happy to run straight through this and not have its cell body there. Its cell body is in the central nervous system. Its axon can run happily through the trigeminal ganglion. It doesn't mind that it's around a bunch of sensory neurons that have their cell bodies here. So that's what's happening in the trigeminal ganglion. It's where all of the primary sensory afferents that run in the trigeminal nerve have their cell bodies, because their cell bodies are not in the central nervous system. Alright, let's continue on. So, we now need to see the output from the trigeminal ganglia, the three output nerves coming out of the trigeminal ganglia. So, let me show these now in yellow here. So, whoops, I need my pen. Out of the trigeminal ganglia, then, come three output nerves. One medial, like this, in yellow. Then another that's a little bit more lateral, here in yellow. And a third one here, and I'll put them in on the other side as well. So here's the first one, here is the second one, whoops, no, that's not the second one, I'll modify this a little bit, there's the second one, and here is the third one. Okay, so the trigeminal ganglion gives out three separate nerves, so the axons that run through the trigeminal ganglion, either the peripheral processes of the pseudo-unipolar neurons or the axons of the motor neurons, they can go down one of these three nerves. So what are these three divisions of the trigeminal nerve now called? Well, let's just revise them. So they have short names and then they have long names. We'll start by going over their short names. So their short names are to call them 5A, 5B, and 5C. However, they also have long names, so let's now go over their long names. 5A, its full name is the ophthalmic nerve. And I'm getting bored of having to write nerves. Oh, well, I will get bored of having to write nerves, so I'm going to abbreviate nerve just to N now. And remember when you're spelling ophthalmic to always remember the H, even though it's very easy to just put OP thalamic. But do remember that there's an H there. So, which one of these output nerves that I have coming out of the trigeminal ganglion is actually the ophthalmic nerve? This one, the most medial one here, and that's the first one that we'll start by studying. So it's going to actually go into the orbital cavity and branch out and supply all sorts of things around that region. Let's now name 5B. So 5B is the one in the middle, so this one. This side shows it better than this side. This side went a little bit wrong. It should sort of be in this position, like on this side. So 5B is here, and it's called the maxillary nerve. So let me write this down. So 5B is the maxillary nerve. And 5C, the final one, which is the most lateral one, so this one here and this one here, that's called the mandibular nerve. So 5C is the mandibular nerve. And there we have it. Those are the three divisions of the trigeminal nerve, the three major components of the trigeminal nerve: the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. So they all come out of the trigeminal ganglion here. So, we're going to continue on. We're going to follow these nerves and see their major branches. And I promise you, it is worth doing all of this anatomy. It's nice to revise it all, and it will aid your understanding of headaches. We will use a lot of this later on as well. Remember, this isn't just about explaining tension-type headaches. This is background stuff that we're going to use a lot later on. So, we're going to begin by going over the ophthalmic nerve then. We want to see the different branches of the ophthalmic nerve. So, ophthalmic means pertaining to the eyes. It's going to go into the orbital cavity. So the first question is, how is it going to get into the orbital cavity? Because at the moment, where is it? It's in the middle cranial fossa, not the orbital cavity. So the way it gets into the orbital cavity is by going for a structure called the superior orbital fissure. So remember, this is the division between the middle cranial fossa and the anterior cranial fossa. Remember, these cranial fossae are not on the same level. The anterior cranial fossa is much higher than the middle cranial fossa. So if I was standing in the middle cranial fossa looking at the anterior cranial fossa, there would be a big wall here, which I'd have to jump up to get into the anterior cranial fossa. In that wall is a slit called the superior orbital fissure that takes me into the cavity underneath the anterior cranial fossa, which happens to be the orbital cavity, in this case the right orbital cavity. So, let's just draw a little picky of this. So I'm going to draw a little picky of this wall that I'd see if I was standing in the middle cranial fossa. So I'm going to imagine I'm a little man standing in the middle cranial fossa looking at this wall here, and I want to see the superior orbital fissure. So I'm doing it on the right hand side here. So this is the jump up. It's the anterior cranial fossa. The anterior cranial fossa is up here. The floor of the middle cranial fossa is here. This is the wall I'm faced with, and this is where the ophthalmic nerve is heading straight to. I'll try and add on the clinoid process like that. So that this thing here is this little speck of bone that I've drawn here. So what's going to happen now? The ophthalmic nerve is going to go through a slit in this wall, which is the superior orbital fissure. So I'll just mark this on, and it's in this sort of position, like so. So it's a slanted slit in this wall. So where can I find the space to actually put the name of this? This is the superior orbital fissure, and there is also an inferior orbital fissure which we'll need to have a look at when we want to do the anatomy of the maxillary nerve. So that's what it looks like from the middle cranial fossa. Of course, we need to have a look at what it looks like from the other aspect when we're looking from the orbital cavity side. So here are our orbital cavities here. Let's think about this. This is the right one viewed from the middle cranial fossa. So what will the slit look like from here? Well, I hope you'll agree it will be on this sort of angle, and there'll be another one on this side as well. So let me just try and put this in. So here, in yellow, this is representing the superior... Whoops, have I done that right? Oh yes, I have done that right. This is representing the superior orbital fissures on both sides, so the right superior orbital fissure and the left superior orbital fissure, and they are in the back wall of the orbit. So if you wanted to go through this from the orbital side, you'd have to stand in the orbital cavity here, and you'd have to go to the back wall, and then you'd find the superior orbital fissure. And just to put this in perspective, let's also put on the optic canal onto this picture. So the optic canal is, of course, the tube through which the optic nerve comes through. So here is where it would be in the orbital cavity. You have to go right up into this medial back corner here, beyond where the superior orbital fissure is. Where does this come out in the middle cranial fossa or in the cranial cavity? It does not come out on this wall here. It comes out up here. It comes out medial to the clinoid process up here. So I'll try and put this in. This is where the optic canal on both sides comes out, and of course this position, and I should have done that in white rather than blue. I'll even undo it. This position here that I've just marked out, this bit here, this is bone, and it's above where the pituitary fossa is, so this is a different level of bone to this level. This is much deeper, whereas this is hoisted up, it's higher up. This is where the optic chiasm is, and this is called the chiasmatic groove. So both of the optic nerves come out of the orbital cavity, emerge up here to the medial side of the clinoid processes, and then you'll have the optic chiasm in this chiasmatic groove here. Right, so there is the superior orbital fissure that we wanted. So what's going to now happen is the ophthalmic nerve is going to go through the superior orbital fissure, and of course it's going to arrive in the orbital cavity. So let's try and mark this on our picture. So I'm going to go for some mustard yellow colour. So let's imagine that we can chop out the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, chop that bit of bone out so that we can see the orbital cavity below. So this would be the orbital cavity below, and of course you would have the globe, the eyeball, in there. So, just adding on the ophthalmic nerve then, it's come through the superior orbital fissure. Of course you wouldn't be able to see it like that, it's underneath bone here, and it's arrived in the orbital cavity here, and I want to now see its major branches. Now I'm not going to tell you every single branch that is known to man of the trigeminal nerves, ophthalmic nerve division. I'm just going to tell you the major ones that will be relevant for us to know about. So, let's draw a bigger picture of that orbital cavity and have a look at the divisions of the ophthalmic nerve. So where should we go? We'll go up here. So, try and draw it bigger here. So here is the bigger picture of the orbital cavity from below. So, putting the eyeball in, here is of course the eyeball, like so. And now let's put on our ophthalmic nerve. So I'm going to go for a thicker pen now, even thicker than before. Maybe actually no, that's going to be too thick. We'll have it that thickness. So here comes the ophthalmic nerve, and the ophthalmic nerve is now going to divide into three major branches. One that goes laterally superior to the eyeball, like so, one that stays medial superior to the eyeball, like this, and one that then goes downwards and medially to the eyeball, like this. So this is superior and medially, this is superior and laterally, this is medial and inferior. So let's go back to the thinner pen now, and let's name up these branches. So, starting with this one that goes laterally here, what is the name for this branch of the ophthalmic nerve? So this is the lacrimal nerve. So you can probably guess where this is going. The lacrimal nerve, of course, is going to supply the lacrimal gland. So let's put in the lacrimal gland on the picture. So the lacrimal gland is often drawn as a sort of cloud-shaped structure here. I don't know if it actually does look like a cloud, but this is the way people usually draw it. And it's in that sort of position. It's superior to the eyeball. It's on top of the eyeball because, of course, it's nice that the tears can flow with gravity, and it means that we don't have to put any effort into getting the tears to flow. And it's lateral. It's at the top of the eyeball, and it's lateral side of the eyeball. So it's not on the nasal side of the eyeball. It's up in this position. And of course, it produces tears. These tears go through little ducts and are secreted onto the surface of the conjunctiva that is underneath the eyelids. So if you were able to go underneath your eyelids, they're lined by conjunctiva, as of course the eyeball is covered by conjunctiva at the front, and the lacrimal gland has ducts that end up secreting the tears onto that conjunctiva that lines the inside of the eyelids, the superior eyelids, of course, and that's where the tears come from. They come from that portion of the conjunctiva that is underneath the eyelids. Well, that's where they first arrive anyway, and then they flow down, of course. So, in red here, this is the lacrimal gland, which is responsible for producing tears. Now, the lacrimal nerve then, from the ophthalmic nerve, that is going to supply the lacrimal gland with sensory fibres. The lacrimal gland is innervated by sensory fibres that relay sensory information from the lacrimal gland to the brain. It's also going to supply surrounding tissues of the lacrimal gland with sensory fibres. So, for instance, the superior eyelid, it will also supply that with sensory fibres. You may be wondering, what about the stimulation to the lacrimal gland? What stimulates the lacrimal gland to actually produce tears? That's the parasympathetic nervous system, and the ophthalmic nerve does not carry parasympathetic nervous system fibres. We will see later on when we discuss cluster headaches, because cluster headaches are very often accompanied by crying. We will see then where the parasympathetic innervation for the lacrimal gland comes from. It actually comes from the facial nerve, the 7th cranial nerve, but we'll discuss the anatomy of the 7th cranial nerve later on. I bet you can't wait. So that's the lacrimal nerve, one of the branches of the ophthalmic nerve. Let's now do the next branch along. And as we've understood the lacrimal nerve at the moment, all it contains is the sensory fibres that are going to innervate the lacrimal gland and surrounding tissues of the orbit. So it innervates really this superior part of the orbit, but it doesn't actually innervate the eye. The eye is going to have innervation that we'll see later on. So let's now do this branch here, superior and medial branch. What is this called? This is called the frontal nerve. And the frontal nerve is going to split into two smaller branches. So I'll draw this here. Thicker pen back, if you please. So it's now going to split into two smaller branches, like this, which are going to go up and innervate the forehead. So this is why the ophthalmic nerve is particularly interesting for us to know about, because these two branches of the frontal nerve here are now going to go up onto the forehead, innervate tissues of the forehead, including the frontalis muscle. Not with motor fibers though, with sensory fibers. So these nociceptors in the frontalis muscle, their primary nociceptive afferents, peripheral processes, will be running in one of these two nerves that goes into the frontal nerve, then into the ophthalmic nerve, and then the cell body will be in the trigeminal ganglion. Isn't that nice? We're starting to see why he's actually showing us all this anatomy. Isn't this nice to know? So what are the two branches of the frontal nerve called? So they've got, whoops, that's a little bit too thick. Let's get rid of that if we can. Excellent. So they have very simple names. They're called the supratrochlear nerve and also the supraorbital nerve. So try and guess which one's which. The one that is medial is the supratrochlear nerve, and the one that is a little bit more lateral is the supraorbital nerve. So supratrochlear and supraorbital. And so to spell it out, this is the supratrochlear one, and this is the supraorbital one. Now the supratrochlear one, to get onto the forehead, it literally just comes round and goes out of the orbit and then up onto the forehead. So showing this on this picture, this is the path of the supratrochlear nerve on both sides, like so. Whereas the supraorbital one actually goes for a special little canal and out onto a foramen here on the forehead like this. Okay, and I should have tried to show this one going a little bit more lateral. They need to innervate the entire forehead here. Okay, so what is the name of that foramen called? Well, it is the supraorbital foramen. So the supraorbital nerve goes through the supraorbital foramen. So there is a little hole on the surface of the frontal bone of the skull. So little hole in this position just above the orbital cavity here, which is called the supraorbital foramen. How does the supraorbital nerve get into that? Well, in the top portion of the orbital cavity, there is again a little hole which the supraorbital nerve goes through. It enters a little tube that we call the supraorbital canal, then it comes out of the supraorbital foramen and then is up on the scalp. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Bring that back. Good job, there's a redo button. So, this one actually is going to go up. I should really, I won't be able to do this, I doubt, but have we got an eraser? No, we don't. Really, it shouldn't have that bit that I'm now hovering over in red. It should go into a hole that's in the superior roof of the orbital cavity, enter the supraorbital canal, and then come out of the supraorbital foramen. But you get the point with this. Supratrochlear nerve and supraorbital nerve, they supply sensory innervation to the forehead and also the scalp. So the anterior portion of the scalp, not just the forehead. So these go back further. They go and cover the anterior portion of the forehead. The anterior portion of the scalp, the top of the head. So the forehead and the anterior portion of the scalp, all of the sensory innervation from those regions comes through these nerves, not motor supply to the frontalis. That comes through the facial nerve rather than the trigeminal nerve. Okay, so that is interesting. We now know where the primary nociceptive afferents of the frontalis muscle will actually run. Their peripheral processes will come in one of these two nerves, into the frontal nerve, into the ophthalmic nerve. The cell body will be in the trigeminal ganglion, and the central process will go into the pons, into the trigeminocervical complex. Lovely. Let's do the final branch of the ophthalmic nerve, and then we'll have a break. So the final branch of the ophthalmic nerve is called the nazociliary nerve, or the nazociliary branch. So nazociliary nerve. Oh, and I've forgotten my abbreviation of down to N. So the nazociliary nerve, it's going to give off quite a few important branches that I just want to quickly go over. Before we go over the branches that it gives off, let's just go into what it actually becomes. So if we just follow this nerve on, it's going to leave the orbit at the bottom. Remember, it's the inferior medial one. It leaves the orbit at the bottom and becomes the infratrochlear nerve. So it's going to be difficult for me to show this without it getting confused with the supratrochlear and the supraorbital. So it's going to go down like this, and it will become the infratrochlear nerve. And again, I've managed to forget to go back to the thinner pen. So it becomes the infratrochlear nerve, and that gives sensory innervation to the inferior portions, inferior tissues of the orbit. So for instance, the inferior eyelid, sensory innervation to that portion will come from the infratrochlear nerve. So it supplies sensory innervation to a lot of the surrounding tissue on the inferior side of the eyeball itself. So the lacrimal nerve, if you like, supplies sensory innervation to surrounding tissue of the eyeball at the top, and the infratrochlear nerve does it at the bottom of the orbit. Now, the next question, of course, that we need to ask is, where does the innervation, the sensory innervation of the actual eyeball itself come from? The eyeball does have pain fibres in there, and also other types of sensory fibres. It would hurt if there's something inside your eye activating these nociceptors, but where does that sensory innervation come from? It comes off the nazociliary nerve. So, the nazociliary nerve gives two major types of branches off that are going to go into the eyeball. One of these types of branches is going to go into the ciliary ganglion. It's going to be difficult for me to actually show this because I've put everything quite far forward. Ideally, I'd move all of this back a little bit so that I had more space here to work with, but let's try and make do. So in the orbital cavity, there is a structure which we will come back to later on called the ciliary ganglion. I'll put it in this sort of position. It's in this sort of area. It's in the medial superior sort of part of the orbital cavity. And I think on my picture, this is the best place to put it. So over that arrowhead, you're being deleted, being replaced with the ciliary ganglion. So this is the ciliary ganglion here in blue. So ciliary means pertaining to the eye, I think, as well. Ganglion, of course, we've already been over that. It means collection of cell bodies that is outside of the central nervous system. So this is going to contain a whole bunch of cell bodies. However, of course, we know that the sensory fibres that are going to come from the nazociliary nerve, they have their cell bodies back in the trigeminal ganglion. They're not going to have their cell bodies in the ciliary ganglion, so they're actually just going to send their peripheral processes straight through this. This is going to contain cell bodies of parasympathetic nervous system post-ganglionic fibres that innervate muscles and secretory apparatus inside the eyeball itself. And again, we will come on to that when we discuss cluster headaches. We don't need to know anything about that until we discuss cluster headaches. So, and let's put on some branches from the nazociliary nerve then. So we'll go for green. So here is a branch, and you have generally a few more than one branch, so I'll put two there. Branches coming from the nazociliary nerve going into the ciliary ganglion. And these, remember, are peripheral processes of pseudo-unipolar primary sensory afferents. And they're just going to run straight through the ciliary ganglion. They're not going to synapse, they're not going to have their cell bodies there, and they will come out of its output branches here, which are called the short ciliary nerves. So in green there, and I should have chosen a different colour, those are the short ciliary nerves. So these are the output of the ciliary ganglion. And these penetrate the sclera of the eyeball, and they then go into the space between the sclera and the choroid of the eyeball, and they then are going to innervate the tissues of the eyeball. They will move in that potential space between the sclera and the choroid, and they will innervate all of the different tissues in the eyeball. So these short ciliary nerves, these are the output branches from the ciliary ganglion. They will contain more than just primary sensory afferents, by the way. They'll also contain postganglionic parasympathetic fibres and postganglionic sympathetic fibres, but we'll come on to that later on. We're just interested in the sensory ones at the moment. The sensory ones are going to come in these, they will penetrate through the sclera, and they will then be in that space between the sclera and the choroid. They can go all over the eyeball and innervate the eyeball with their respective sensory modalities. So that's one of the ways in which sensory fibres from the nazociliary nerve can get into the eyeball. There is another way, however, the long ciliary nerve, which I will put here in light green. So this structure in light green here, this is called the long ciliary nerve. And again, this is going to contain the peripheral processes of pseudo-unipolar primary sensory afferents that are coming from the nazociliary nerve, penetrating the sclera, going into that space between the sclera and the choroid, and moving in that potential space, and which will innervate tissues in the eyeball. So from the nazociliary nerve come branches that go into the ciliary ganglion, and then this branch that goes straight into the eyeball itself. From the ciliary ganglion come the short ciliary nerves here, which then penetrate the sclera and enter the eyeball itself. So this is how the peripheral processes of primary sensory afferents get into the eyeball. They'll then have their sensory apparatus, their sensory device at the end, and they'll be innervating the eyeball tissue. So, these then are the major branches of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. We will see a few more later on as we go through the video, but for now, this is a good enough look at the branches of the ophthalmic nerve for us. Overall, we have seen that this branch of the trigeminal nerve carries sensory information of all the different modalities from the forehead and the top of the scalp, and also the orbital cavity from the eye and all the surrounding tissues in the orbital cavity, including the lacrimal glands and the eyelids. So that's what we've seen that this one does. Join me for the next video and we will continue on with the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve, looking at the maxillary nerve. And please don't get bored. This is all worth it. It's a good revision of the anatomy, and it is going to help our understanding of headaches. We have a lot to cover, and when we're looking at all these different headache disorders all in one, it's a good idea to know the background anatomy. Because we're going to cover so many different topics, we have a good excuse to go into this amount of anatomy because we can use it for all of them. So join me for the next video.